5 lines from the top. Rabbi Linzer, Rabbi Shimon, Omi, Bechad B'Tishrei. So we finally have moved on from Echad B'Nisan and unpacking the different ways in which Echad B'Nisan is Rosh Chodesh, particularly with a look at Baal Ta'acher, an extensive look at Baal Ta'acher. Then a Breita that had a number of other ways in which Nisan was Rosh Chodesh. Not Rosh Chodesh, which Nisan was Rosh Hashanah. And now we move on to the other Rosh Hashanah and the issue about Maaser Behemah. So we have that the idea of the Tanakama, which is that Elul is the Rosh Hashanah for Maaser Behemah, and now the debate. Rabbi Linzer and Rabbi Shimon mean be'echad b'Tishrei. Rabbi Linzer and Rabbi Shimon say it is on the first of Tishrei. So let's take a look. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says Rabbi Yochanan v'shneim nikra echad darshu. They both learned it out from the same verse. What is the verse? Lavshu karim hatzon v'amakim ya'atu bar yitrora'u af yashiru. So the literally the blankets will cloak the sheep, but this is understood to mean that the male sheep will mount the female sheep. They'll be covered up, the one sheep will cover up the other in this act, in having in having sex. The amakim ya'atfi bar, the valleys will be sort of cloaked in grain. Yitroa'u af yashiru, they will bleat forth or trumpet forth, even give song. So what does that have to do with anything? So let's take a look. So it says Rabbi Meir Sava. Rabbi Meir holds that the Rosh Hashanah for the Maaser Behemah, which means when the year of the sheep ends. Sounds like Chinese, the year of the sheep. Anyway, hold on. So he says, Rabbi Meir Savar, Emasai Lavshu Karim Hatzon. When is it that the sheep are mounting? That they're reproducing. Well, not reproducing, but that they're basically, what's the word? Not conceiving. Bizman Shamakim Ya'atfu Bar. That happens. That mating happens at the time when the valleys are cloaked in grain. Now, the Eimatai Amakim Ya'atud Bar, when are the valleys cloaked in grain? But Adar, okay, it is in Adar. So it is Nisan is like when the grain becomes ripe and the barley becomes ready to be harvested. But the original cloaking of the grain already happens in Adar. So the sheep are therefore mating in Adar. So abrot be'adar, they conceive in Adar, v'yodot ba'av, and they give birth in Av because apparently sheep give birth after 5 months of gestation. So Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av. Okay, so therefore they give birth in Av. So if they're giving birth in Av, that's the New Year's crop of sheep get born in Av. So the Rosh Hashanah, the end of that year, defines the end of one and the beginning of the next, is after the new crop has been born. Rosh Hashanah Shalahem Elul. So the Rosh Hashanah is the first of Elul. Yes, so what's your question? How come we're looking?
No, I don't have a question.
Yes? Okay, I thought I saw you raise your hand.
No.
Okay, fine. So Rosh Hashanah Shalahem Elul. Rabbi Linzer, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Linzer and Rabbi Shimon say, Eimatai lafshu karim hatzon. No. When is it that the blankets the sheep are being cloaked with quote unquote blankets that they're mating? Bizman shitroa'u af yashiru. It skips over the amakim ya'atfu bar and goes to yitroa'u af yashiru when they are trumpeting forth and giving song. Eimatai shivalim omrot shira. When is it that the stalks are giving song? Meaning, like the wind blows through the stalks and they make a rustling, and that's the giving forth of song that this is referring to. Right? The valleys that are cloaked in grain are giving forth song because the grain is like rustling in the wind. So when does that happen? That's B'Nisan. That's not in Adar. They have to grow a little bit higher and get a little riper before this reality exists. So it's only happening in Nisan when they're mating. Wrote Nisan, so if they become pregnant in Nisan, Yodot be'Elul, they give birth in Elul a month later. So if they're giving birth in Elul, Rosh Hashanah Shalahem Tishrei. Their Rosh Hashanah is Tishrei. So basically the question, although so fascinating that it's learning it from a verse, the question is, when are sheep mating? When primarily do sheep give birth? And therefore, after the period where sheep are primarily giving birth, then you are going to have the Rosh Hashanah to be the month that follows that. That's the new year. Now, of course, one would imagine that both of these things are happening, which is what the Gemara is going to say, that there are sheep being born in Av, thank you, and sheep being born in Elul. Or else, they're just looking at a pasuk. I mean, there must be a reality out there. And that's what the Gemara will say, that actually it is happening both in Av and in Elul. The question is, which one do you put your emphasis on? Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara.
You don't see these psukim as a smachta?
Yeah, fine.
I was basically going to ask that if it's biblical, it should be from Chumash, not from Tehillim.
Well, okay, that's not always such a question. You could use Tehillim to do Gilui Milsa Ba'alma. It's not really telling you halacha. It's just cluing you into the facts and so on. But anyway, let's take a look at the Gemara. Now, how much are you really learning it from the psukim? So the Gemara does seem to treat it seriously. So let's take a look. So the Gemara says like this. Okay, Rosh Hashanah the one that says that that the mating occurs in Adar and not in Nisan. Doesn't it also speak about them bursting forth in trumpeting and in song, which happens later in Nisan? So ba'aflasa. No, that's like the ones that are late. The late maters do it in Nisan. Okay, Dahavin b'Nisan. But the primary mating happens in Adar, and the primary birthing happens in Av. The idach nami haksiv amakim ya'atfubar. But the other one, doesn't it say that the valleys will be cloaked in grain? So, which happens in Adar. Doesn't it say that that's also when the mating happens? No, that's the ones that are mating early. The Asyan Me'adar. But they start in Adar, which means both things happen. There's mating in Adar, there's mating in Nisan. Because there's birthing in Av, there's birthing in Elul. The question is, which one do you say is the primary? And which one do you say, yeah, that's the early one, or that's the late one. But the real one is this one. Right? So it's looking at the reality where both things are happening, where they're giving birth throughout the whole period, and identifying which is the one that I see to be the primary and which one am I going to sort of say is secondary. But they both agree that the Metzias is both things happen. Now I have to tell you that if they're both agreeing that the Metzias is that both things happen, it really does not, personally, I don't understand how you would put a Rosh Hashanah, after the primary crop is born, before the late ones are born. It's still all the ending of the birthing from the previous year. You want the Rosh Hashanah to be after the whole process is over, not just after the primary part is over. So even if you admit that the primary thing is being born in Av, Av, and the secondarily, it's the late ones are being born in Elul, you would still say, fine, make the Rosh Hashanah after everything is born. Make the Rosh Hashanah in Tishrei. So I don't really understand, the logic here that it all goes by what's primary rather than going when the whole thing is over, which should have everybody agreeing Tishrei. Anyway, that's my ha'ara. Let's see where the Gemara goes with this. Yes, Charlie.
Steinsaltz says that actually most sheep conceive in the fall and give birth in the spring.
So much for all of this. So I have no comment. Does it have any attempt to reconcile that?
Not really.
Okay then. Excellent. So now the Gemara goes down and says,
Babylonian sheep.
Exactly. Or Israel sheep. I mean, does it say where it's looking? It just says sheep in general.
What do you say?
All right. So the Gemara says like this. Okay. B'Shleim Rabbi Meir K'dichsi. So according to Rabbi Meir, the verse reads well. Lavshu karim hatzon. When do they mate? Bizman shamakim yatzubar. When the valleys are cloaked in grain in Adar. Viganami, and after that happens, there's also a next crop of Yitro Af Yashiru that do it when the grain is rustling and giving forth song. There's a later crop that happens in Nisan. Elo, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, but Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, that they focus the primary thing on Nisan and just the early thing on Adar. The pasuk should be written in the opposite order, right? The pasuk is strange. It should have started by saying that the mating happens when the grain is rustling in Nisan. And there's secondarily, there's also early ones, the amakim yatrubar, that happen when the valleys are originally cloaked in grain. So the pasuk is a funny read according to them because it's giving primacy to the thing that they are saying is the secondary period. Elama Rava, so rather Rava says, everybody agrees that the basic mating period occurs, like the pasuk says, when the valley is cloaked in grain, which means in Adar. And if the basic period occurs in Adar, then everybody agrees that the basic birthing period occurs in Av. So what's the issue, whether it's Elul or Tishrei? So, the Adar. Here's what they're debating. Aser to Aser, you shall take your tithe, Eis Chol Tuat Zarecha, B'shnei Maser Sakasim Medaber, Echad Maser Behema, V'echad Maser Dagan. So because it says you shall take your tithe in this double language, Aser to Aser, we say it's alluding not only to the tithing of grain, but also to the tithing of animals. And linking the two. So for what purpose is it linking the two? Rabbi Meir Savar, Makish Maser Behema LaMaser Dagan. Here's the reason the Torah compares the two. Why? Ma Maser Dagan Samuch L'Gemaro Isuro. The same way by grain, when it is near being complete, or I shouldn't say it that way. Soon after the period of its completion is when you take Maser. When is the new year for grain? We're going to learn in the next clause of the Mishnah. Tishrei. Why Tishrei? What happens right around Tishrei? What Chag is Tishrei? Right? It's Sukkot. What's Sukkot? Right? Chag HaAsif. You're gathering in the grain. So the ending of the process of the grain determines when the new year is for Maaser. The Maaser year begins when the end process, when the process ended, although it is interesting, right? Because talking about, making a new year in the middle of a process, which is what I was talking about before the sheep, if Sukkot is when you're doing the gathering in, so then the new year is starting before the processing is fully complete, right? Which is a little bit bizarre. So anyway, but nevertheless, by the grain we see that the new year for Maaser is right after or juxtaposed to the ending of the previous of the finishing of the previous of the process of the grain. So samuch l'gemaro isuro, af maser behema samuch l'gemaro isuro. So similarly by animals, right juxtaposed to right after it's done, meaning if the birthing is primarily happening in Av, so right after that period of it being done, of it being born, that's when you have the Rosh Hashanah in Elul, right afterwards. Just like, so it's paralleling in terms of the logic behind it. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, Savri, but Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon, so no. Makish Meiser Behema L'Maser Dagan. Here's the way they're linked. Not in terms of identifying a similar application of the same underlying reasoning, but just completely looking at the form. And they say, Ma Maaser Dagan Rosh Hashanah Shelo Tishrei, Av Maaser Behema Rosh Hashanah Shelo Tishrei. No, it's a simple link. Tishrei. So one says, yes, they're linked. How are they linked? The same date or the same logic. And if you say same date, it's Tishrei. If you say the same logic, it's going to be Elul. So that's what the Gemara says. Although, again, it was, I think, a little bit more interesting, putting the pasuk aside, when it was actually acknowledging that this process happens over time, like the period of Chag HaAsif, and then do you sort of put the Rosh Hashanah after the primary period is over, or after the whole period is over? Okay, yes?
In general, that's a really interesting question in cultures. In other words, where do you mark a process? Like, when should Yom HaShoah be?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a process of human experience, but you need to mark it with a memory.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part of,
nice
part
point.
of that whole thing.
Nice point. Okay. Okay. So now the Gemara goes on. Let's take a look. So now, so we've done now two. We've done Nisan and Elul, although Elul is debated, but we have this possibility of that second one of Maaser Behema. And now we get to Tishrei, and Tishrei has a whole list of things. To remind you what the list of things are about Tishrei, in the first Mishnah, it says Rosh Hashanah Lishanim, for years, whatever that means. Shmitim, it starts, the new Shemitah year begins on, the cycle of the Shemitah. What year is it in the cycle of the 7-year cycle? Begins on Tishrei, like which Meiser year it is, whether it's a Shemitah year. Yovel begins on Tishrei. Nitiyah Ulirakot. Nitiyah is planting for Orla. Which year of Orla it is gets incremented not from the date the tree was planted. You don't wait to the birthday of the tree. It gets incremented at Rosh Hashanah Tishrei. And Yirakot is Maaser Yerek. When the vegetables are harvested, you go by, which Maaser year it goes by, it goes for them by Tishrei. Okay, so all these things, a lot about the agricultural mitzvos of Trumos and Maisros and Shemitah and Yovel and so, well, Yovel isn't exactly agricultural. Anyway, all of those things, plus a few others. So now let's take a look, though, what the first line means. Lishanim, for years. What does that mean, for years? For what purpose are you telling me that Tishrei is the beginning of the year? Amar Rav Papa, lishtaros, for documents. This might sound familiar. If it's predated, it's invalid. Post-dated, it's valid. So you have to make sure you're writing the right date on the document. So you have to know whether to increment it. So the Gemara said, when does the year get incremented? So Gemara says, 1 minute. But the first line of the Mishnah is the first of Nisan is Rosh Hashanah for kings. So what's the halachic relevance of calling it a new year for kings? For documents. So make up your mind. Do you go by Nisan or Tishri when you're incrementing the years on your documents? So the Gemara says, lo kash, it's not difficult. Kan l'malchi Yisrael, kan l'malchi Yumasa Olam, which is the difference whether it is the Jewish kings or the non-Jewish kings. The Jewish kings you'll increment at Nisan, because that also focuses on Chodesh Hazelachem Rosh Chadashim, and the emphasis of Pesach and Nisan being the beginning of the year, the beginning of the counting of the months. And for non-Jewish kings, you will go for the first of Tishrei, and therefore, depending on whether you are dating your document to Jewish kings or non-Jewish kings, the years will increment differently.
Does that mean if I'm doing business with a Jew, I date the deed one way, and if I'm doing business with a Gentile, I date it a different way?
It could be. The Gemara also says that certain documents they said are supposed to be for the Gentile kings because of Shalom Malchus. You want to be,
right.
So exactly when you do one, there are different circumstances. Okay, and also it's not just, it's the same year, but you are, when I do it with a non-Jew, I call it 2013, and when I do it with a Jew, I call it 2014. It's for a different king. So according to one, I'm saying in the 7th year of King David's reign, and in the other, I'm saying in the 24th year of so-and-so's reign. So if you're referencing a different king, and when you're doing a Jewish king, it goes by Nisan, non-Jewish, it goes by Tishrei. Now, interestingly, I always understood that the Chiddush of the Torah, and this might, still be true, but HaChodesh Hazelachem Rosh Chadashim is that because the natural agricultural cycle has Tishrei at the beginning, which is why, we have Tishrei for us for counting. It's funny that the Gemara, by the way, does not mention, if I told you the number of the year increments on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, what number of the year would you say gets incremented? What number for us increments on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei? What? The Brias Olam, right? The counting not to a king, right, but for creation. 5774, not 2013, 2014, right? Well, we increment from creation. It's interesting that the Gemara does not reference that as a way of documenting Shtarot. Okay, but normally anyway, the year presumably, the natural way, I've always assumed, is to start at Tishrei. We'll see later the Gemara, Tishrei, Nivra Olam, and so on. That's when we assume that the world was created. We'll get to that in a minute. But more than just the issue of counting from creation is the fact that the agricultural cycle, it's like the school year begins in September, right? So why does the school year begin in September? Well, why don't we school? Because the kids would go home and help their parents on the farm, right? And then, whatever, the new agricultural cycle would begin, would begin in September. And that's when the plowing and the planting and all of that begins, right? And that's why, Sukkot is B'tzeit Hashanah or B'tkufat Hashanah. Because by Sukkot it's when you're ending one period and you're gathering in the grain from one and you're beginning the next period. So the agricultural cycle naturally is a Tishrei. And then the Torah comes along and says, no, now it's not just about the natural world. There's about history and God and HaChodesh Hazelachem Rosh Chadashim. There's a different way of counting. There's a way of counting from redemption and from God's intervention in history. And and that creates its own type of a cycle and a way of perceiving of time, not just in terms of the natural world. And that's the Chiddush of that the months start from Nisan and Rosh Chadashim, although the years in this end are still incrementing from Tishrei in terms of Briat Olam. It explains why you have that bizarre thing that the months are numbered from Nisan and the years are numbered from Tishrei. There are essentially two different cycles going on here: the natural agricultural and the historical Jewish revelation. So that explains this difference. Also, again, about the Jewish kings Nisan, non-Jewish kings Tishrei. The only thing that a little throws a wrench in it, is that, and I have to look into this more, but somebody told me that in Bavel, because they got these also names of the months from Babylon, that actually the year did start in Nisan, not in Tishrei. So it wasn't only sort of the Jew, apparently, because that's another logical way to start the year. Spring is the time where, things are coming alive. There's like the dead of winter, and then it's also redemptive in terms of Geulah and history, but even if, look at the natural world. When would you say the year begins? Planting begins in Tishrei, in the fall, but the birthing maybe, begins in the spring. So apparently that's, it's not just, so that's another sort of way in which sort of in a natural sense, Nisan could be seen as the beginning of the year as well.
Why do we date to both Isha and Briata?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let's hold off on that a bit because, again, in the it used to be that there was this thing called Minyan Shtarot as well. So let's move on a bit in the Gemara. So the Gemara says like this. Okay, so anyway, so it depends how you're counting. Jewish kings Nisan, non-Jewish kings Tishrei. So the Gemara says, Rav Chizda, Rav Chizda mas Nisan asalash minun. So 1 minute. So if Rav Chizda says the difference between Malchei Yisrael and Malchei Umos Olam, right, and that's when the Mishnah says Nisan, it's only talking about Malchei Yisrael. So it sounds like he's saying his own Chiddush. I'm going to tell you something. The Mishnah says Nisan, but that's only for Malchei Yisrael. Malchei Umos Olam is different. But now you're telling me that's Pshat in the Mishnah. When the Mishnah says Tishrei is years, it means non-Jewish kings, years go from Tishrei. So why is Rav Chizda saying a Chiddush? It's really just Pshat in the Mishnah. So you could say he's telling me what the Mishnah means, but okay. So the Mishnah says, Lo, Rav Chizda cry asa le'ashmunan. Rav Chizda is coming to explain to us psukim, meaning that there are psukim, about, if you remember, the Gemara quoted the psukim about how we know that you increment the years, and it quoted some psukim from Nehemiah, remember, by the Persian kings, and there was Tishrei, and by the Jewish kings, Shlomo was Nisan. So Rav Chizda was not coming to explain the Mishnah. The Mishnah does, in a way, reflect those two countings. Rav Chizda was coming to reconcile the verses. Okay, so what have we said now? Version number 1 is that the Mishnah, when it says Mlachim, means counting for non-Jewish kings, and for Jewish kings, and that's Nisan. And when it says Gesundheit Shtarim, and when it says Shanim, it means counting for non-Jewish kings, and that's from Tishrei. Okay, if you want, I'll tell you. Rav Chizda Rabbi Zera Masnila. You know what? You're right. Rav Chizda saying his Chiddush, and he's saying his Chiddush in the Mishnah, and he's making a distinction between Nisan and Tishrei, but he's saying it about, Jewish and non-Jewish kings, but he's saying that as his own Chiddush. It's not Pshat, it's not what the second phrase in the Mishnah means. So what does the second phrase in the Mishnah mean when it says Tishrei is the beginning of years? It means something else. It means what Rabbi Zera says. What does Rabbi Zera says? Rabbi Zera Amar Litkufa. Rabbi Seir says the purpose of saying Rosh Tishrei is the beginning of years is for tikufah, which means what? It means for the astronomical cycle, for sort of counting, how do we, when we figure out the astronomy, like, when they sort of figure out, like, when do you say Birchas HaChama, when the sun is back to where it was, its position. Well, yes, but here also, right, the position of the sun relative to the constellations, right, and where was that when the world was created? So, well, when was the world created? So he's basically saying that he believes that that Tishrei is when the world was created, and therefore, when you want to sort of figure out where are we relative to the original placement of the sun and the stars and the constellations, so you should know that we are going to sort of focus on how everything was sort of, where the place everything was on the first of Tishrei. Now, it's really a little sort of like, glossing over the problem here, which is, what difference does it make? Right? You know where things are now. If you sort of know the math, the system in which they work, you sort of you retroactively figure out where they were. So 5,774 years ago in Tishrei, they were in place X. And 5,774 years ago in Nisan, they were in place Y. So other than for the halacha of Birchas HaChama, who cares? I mean, it's just an arbitrary point in a process that you're sort of counting from. So there's a long Tosfos, which I have to tell you I didn't really understand because he gets into all the computation of Tkufot, which was beyond me. But he tries to sort of explain why sort of some of this matters in terms of what you define as your starting point. At least I'll say the nafkamin is for Birchas HaChama, which is the one halacha which is based on where we think everything was, b'shas priyas ha'olam. Yes.
But our custom for Birchas HaChama is actually based on the New Year being in Nisan. Because we say it right before Pesach.
Is that true? It's based on the position?
It was actually Erev Pesach the last time.
Because it's so funny, because in all other ways we say that we basically paskin that B'tishrei Nivra Ha'olam.
Yeah, and it's in our Piyutim on Yom Kippur. But Birchas HaChama is always in Nisan.
Wow, I'm going to have to get back to you on that. That is a good point. Okay, so anyway, Rabbi Eliezer, and this is going according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar B'tishrei Nivra Olam, So therefore, if you want to figure out where we are, sort of, in terms of the positioning of the sun and the stars and the seasons and so on, then he's saying that, that we sort of look back to the first of Tishrei is the beginning of a new astronomical year. Yes?
Gemara is addressing Charlie's point by saying that, yes, it's includes Kufa, but this kind of holds not
Right.
Nisan, so we hold Nisan.
Right. But Charlie, meaning it's certainly possible to hold Tishrei, yes.
Yeah.
But Charlie, I think, but the point still is that what do you call it? Is that it is a little bizarre because in other areas we hold that we basically say B'Tishrei Nivra Olam.
That's agree.
Right. No, but Charlie, right. Charlie is not asking what's on the Gemara. He's pointing out an inconsistency between our general attitude
Right.
of Tishrei Nivra Olam and our saying of Birchas Hachama in Nisan.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Right. But this Tana could hold. It's all right. It's all the same. Yes.
So I have a similar question along that line. If Tishrei we would do Birchas Hachama, let's just say in Tishrei, on the first day of Tishrei?
No, so that's another good point also, because when we really say Nivra Olam, it's really we're saying when Adam was created, and therefore we actually say that the world was created like on the 25th of Elul, really, and not on the first, right? And that's actually in the beginning of Tosos. If you take a look at this Tosos, he says, about 10 lines down, he says like this. With line that starts with the word Shmuel, he says, Savak Reb Yoshua to Rabbi Eliezer b'chafhei be'elul nivra ha'olam, Rabbi Yoshua b'chafhei ba'adar, hainu d'kashin nivra Adam b'shishi kidesh ha'chodesh, and that's when it was either Rosh Chodesh Tishrei or Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Okay. Anyway, but he tries to go through all the astronomical things. Yes, Charlie, you wanted to say something? Okay. So now let's go on. Okay. So he says Rosh Hashanah is Tishrei. Basically means that we would say just a simple nafkamina is if you're counting by B'yat HaOlam, that's when you increment the shtarot, which goes back to Dove's point, Dovel's point there, which is that it seems from the Gemara they're not referring to B'yat HaOlam as a system of dating shtarot. They're only referring to the idea of melachim. Otherwise, that would have been an easy sort of application of this. Okay, but one explanation is it's a way of counting the years for non-Jewish kings. The other answer is that it is the way of counting the years from creation and from, and it's used for sort of an astronomical years and for astronomical computations. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Ledin. And now we actually turn to what for us is the significance of Rosh Hashanah. It is a day of judgment. So you are judged for the whole year on Rosh Hashanah. So it's the new year, and the way we experience the new year. You're being judged for the following year. God looks at the land or looks at the people from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And from the beginning of the year, God is giving a judgment what will be at the end. And how do you know that's from Tishrei? On Tishrei, right? The pasuk that's often interpreted in the context of Rosh Hashanah, and the end of the pasuk is Chok L'Yisrael Mishpat Le'Elohei Yaakov. And how do we know that's going to be Tishrei and Rosh Hashanah? Well, you could just say Tiku B'Chodesh Shofar. You're blowing the shofar, okay? But the Gemara underscores it even more. Ezu Chag Chodesh Mitkasebo. What is the holiday that the month is covered? You don't see the moon. The only holiday, right? Bakesel Yom Chagenu. What's the only Chag in our calendar that the moon is not really visible or barely visible? It's only a sliver. Heavy Omer, Zeh Rosh Hashanah. That's Rosh Hashanah. It's funny that it just skips over the Tikubach, the shofar part. Okay, the Ksiv, and then the verse says, Ki Chok L'Yisrael Mishpat Le'Elohei Yaakov. It is a day of judgment for God, for the people, and that's why it is Rosh Hashanah is Lishanim, means we are judged for the following year. By the way, Tosos always discusses this idea of Chodesh Mitkasebo, an interesting position of one of the Baalei HaTosvot that claimed that what it meant was that there was no korban of Musaf of Rosh Chodesh on Tishrei, because there was only a Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, not a Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. And then Tosos says, you can't say that. Why? Not because there was a pasuk that said he couldn't say that, but there's a Tosefta that says that you definitely bring a korban musaf of Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Hashanah as well. So then he said back, no, I didn't mean that. What I meant was, of course you're bringing a korban of Rosh Chodesh. What I meant was that the psukim sort of hide the fact they obfuscate the fact that there is a korban of Rosh Chodesh, and that we also don't mention it in our davening. That when we do a musaf of Rosh Hashanah, we do not bring out its identity as Rosh Chodesh. Right? Rosh Hashanah is both Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Chodesh, but that other identity gets subsumed. So technically, you're right. There is a musaf, but it is not something that we sort of focus on. It gets hidden, that other identity, and we don't say it in the musaf of Shemona Esrei. And then Rabbeinu Tam says, actually, I disagree. We do say it in the musaf of Shemona Esrei, and that's why in Rosh Hashanah we follow Rabbeinu Tam. I don't know what the Sephardim do, but we follow Rabbeinu Tam, and we say muvad, musfei. What's the exact language? What? Milvad olas hachodesh hu minchata. We make explicit reference to the fact that there's also a korban of Rosh Chodesh, but that line actually was inserted by Rabbeinu Tam, and so that's interesting read of
changing the Shemona Esrei.
Interesting read of Chodesh mitkaseh means its identity as Rosh Chodesh is subsumed and hidden. Yes.
Two short things. First of all, the pshat of the pasuk is Rosh Chodesh, not any one day of the year, but in other words, one day is a Chodesh.
That is a
second,
good point. Yeah.
Is Rosh Hashanah. Also, was there a sense that Chag B'Tishrei was a pilgrimage? I mean, it's Chag.
Right.
Or that Rosh Chodesh was a pilgrimage.
You mean
Rosh Chodesh was a pilgrimage.
Yeah, but I don't know if Chag means a pilgrimage.
Like in Shmuel. In other words, they went...
Lo Chodesh v'lo Shabbat.
Right, they went to eat with Choseh.
I thought you meant Madua Atolechas Elav Hayom Lo Chodesh v'lo Shabbat. That sort of shows there's a pilgrimage idea around Rosh Chodesh.
There seems to be a pilgrimage idea around Rosh Chodesh.
Yeah, that is true. I would agree with that. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay, now we have a little agadata. Believe me, we'll have plenty of agadata around Rosh Hashanah as a Yom Hadin, but because we're now introducing that idea, we'll have a little agadata. Yes? David, you had a question?
I was just thinking about, maybe it's not exactly the same, when the woman goes when his son dies, and she goes to the prophet, to Elijah, and his husband says, why are you going when it's not Rosh Chodesh?
Right.
But it's not.
Yeah, that's what I just mentioned ago. Yeah, which indicates an idea that there was a pilgrimage ideas around Rosh Hashanah. It also indicates there's pilgrimage ideas around Shabbat, which is a different issue. Like,
what do you mean by pilgrimage? How
could you be right? So again, sort of to going to a wise person, not exactly going to the temple. Anyway, all right, let's take a look.
Also, the very last thing.
Right.
Every Rosh Chodesh.
Right. Midei chodesh b'chodsho, midei Shabbat b'Shabbato. Exactly, and that exactly does tie into that other verse. Exactly.
David was invited to Rosh Chodesh.
I'm sorry?
David was invited to
Right,
Rosh Chodesh.
Exactly. So Pshat in the Psukim definitely is that there was for us, Rosh Chodesh doesn't mean anything. It means Chatzi, it means Chatzi Halel and Musaf, right? But it does seem that Rosh Chodesh was, if you're bringing a Musaf, did have some broader resonance and significance as a Chag. But again, this is being read not as Rosh Chodesh, but as Rosh Hashanah. Tanu Rabanan, Chikot Yisrael hu mishpat lo Yaakov, melamed she'ein beitin shel mala niknasim l'din elam kein kitchu beitin shel mata et hachodesh. So this is a beautiful idea. It's a common idea throughout in general Torah Shabbal Peh is the partnership between God and the people. God gives the law, we interpret it and apply it, so we're sort of partnering with God in what the Torah is. We also partner with God in terms of the calendar, right? That there's, on the one hand, the natural idea of Shabbat, which just occurs all by itself, but then you get to the Moadim and Asher Tiku'u Atam. On the one hand, sort of God creates the natural reality of the moon, but we still have to look at it, interpret it, and give it religious significance. So there's like a type of Torah Shabbat Torah Shabbal Peh going on there, that type of partnership. And even in the very idea of of Rosh Hashanah as a Yom Hadin, which would seem that the whole idea of din is you as the sort of subject, complete submission to authority, but it's only through our role and participation and partnering that we create it as a Yom Hadin, that we actually create, we sanctify the month and create the day as Rosh Chodesh and hence as Rosh Hashanah. So I think a very powerful idea, particularly applied in general, but applied in the context of din. Actually, it's a common theme I use sometimes, whenever when I have to give a sermon on Rosh Hashanah. Thankfully, I'm not a shul rabbi, so it doesn't happen that often. But anyway, a good sort of in the yeshiva we talk about nuggets for sermons. A good nugget that I have for a second day of Rosh Hashanah drasha is that there's a famous midrash, there's a midrash or I think it's in the Zohar, a statement that the difference of the din on the first day Rosh Hashanah and the second day Rosh Hashanah is that the first day is like a harsh din and the second day is like a sweetened din, a softer din, a more compassionate din. And what I say is, one way that's interpreted is that the first day you're sort of judged on your own merits. Masa. Who will stand before God on their own merits. The second day, we're judged as a community and collectively. So there we have everybody else's merits, and we're looked at as an entirety, and that's a softer, a sweeter din. So what's the shot? So I say because if you think about it, how can we call the second day Rosh Hashanah Yom Hadin? Right? Second day Rosh Hashanah is just, it's because of Sfeika Yoma.
Yeah.
It's because of a minhag, it's because of a doubt. It's like God never said it was a Yom Hadin. You guys want to not do malacha, that's your business. I only said that the first day I was going to judge you. So the chiddush is that we can actually turn it into a Yom Hadin by creating it as a Rosh Hashanah. We can also do it in a way work with God and make it what God didn't say was a Yom Hadin. We're going to make it as a Yom Hadin. But if what makes it a Yom Hadin is sort of us working, at the communal level to change its status, so therefore it's a din for us as an entire community and for us sort of in terms of our as a people and our relationship with God and not just as an individual. So that's my whole little second day Rosh Hashanah drasha.
Right.
Okay, thank you. But it goes to this idea of this Gemara underscoring, which is true about every Rosh Chodesh and every Moed, but underscoring the power of that idea in the context of Yom Hadin. It's only Yom Hadin because you've been Mekadosh HaChodesh. Yes.
So on Hashanah Rabbah, at the very end of that, we say sweeten the strict judgment.
Right. Yeah, that's that idea of the sweetening of the din.
Yeah.
Right. So that's Melamed Shein Beistin Shamala Nichnasim Ladin. The heavenly court does not enter into the court doesn't begin. The judge doesn't come in. The witnesses don't come in. Elin Kein Kitru Beistin Shamatas Chodesh. You guys have to sanctify the month. Which again, if you didn't sanctify the month, it'd still be Rosh Chodesh at least by day 31. But you get the idea. Tanya Ida, we taught another brayse. Chok Yisrael who? What does it mean Chok Yisrael? Right? Because that was Chok Yisrael Mishpat Leilo HaYaakov. The Jewish people see it and make it a Yom Hadin, and then it's the day of judgment. Here's another read of the verse. Ainli Elo Yisrael. Maybe it's only a day of judgment for the Jewish people. Umos Ha'olam Minayin. How do I know for the other nations of the world? Tamar Mishpat Leilo HaYaakov. It's a day of judgment for the God of Jacob, so it's the God of Jacob, but still judgment is for everyone, not just judgment for Israel. Israel. So why does it start by saying a judge, a law, an edict for Israel? Because the Israel, the Jewish people, are the ones that are judged first. Like Rav Chizda says, to Amar Rav Chizda, Melch v'tzibur, Melch nichnas tchila ladin. If it's the king and the community, all have to stand in judgment before God. The king is the one that gets judged first. Shne'emar, mishpat avdo u'mishpat amo. God does the judgment of his servant, which is one individual, so here understood to be the leader, u'mishpat amo, and then afterwards the judgment of the entire nation. So, my time, what is this, the reason behind this? I mean, whatever this means on a metaphysical plane, okay, but somehow there's a sense of first focusing on the king, and then the community, or here first Israel and then the rest of the world. So, Ibais Ema Lav Orach Ara Lemekir Malcha Avrai. Number one is, it's not Derech Eretz to have the king waiting and cooling his heels outside in the hallway while the other people are sitting in judgment. So, it's an issue of honor. The way you show honor to the king, or honor to the Jewish people, and so on, is they get to go first. You get to go to the front of the line. You don't have to wait in line. The Ibais, they might have no idea what that means. The Ibais, I know what it means, but okay. The Ibais Ema Mikmi Delay for Sharon Af. No, you want to be judged first before God gets very angry. Like he starts seeing this sin and this sin and that sin. So by the time he gets to the people he's judging later, right then he's fed up with all the sinning, and then there's going to be some more sort of consequence. Now, okay, the high degree of anthropomorphism, I can't even begin to explain, what that means exactly. But I would also sort of say that you could have said the exact opposite, because this is being framed as it's done this way in order to let the king, or by analogy Israel, off easier, right, and get the anger out at the people, get the anger out of the non-Jews. Okay, but in a way, if you think about the king analogy, the logic would go the other way, right? The king is the one who has, the buck stops here, is the one who ultimately is responsible, and if the people are sinning or there's a problem, like, he's the one that was in a position to do the most about it, so he's the one that should actually be carrying the brunt of the weight of responsibility. And you could have said it that way. Why is he judged first? because not like God only starts looking at all the sins after the other people. God knows the whole story, and you bring the person who's responsible, you bring them in first, and you give them the judgment for their responsibility, their heightened responsibility for everything. And if you read it that way, the issue of the Jewish people also, what's the idea of the analogy of king to people and Jewish people to also love? You could speak about this idea of, what's the pasuk say? It says, right? We have this unique relationship to God. We should know better, in terms of what we do and our sinning and whatever. We're supposed to be an or lagoyim. So you could speak about, you could make an analogy that way. We get judged first because we have a larger responsibility, and not so not the way the Gemara has it, which is to get off easy. Okay, so it's quite interesting, sort of the way the Gemara framed it, and I have a hard, Anyway, I have a hard time explaining exactly what the point is about the way the Gemara sort of framed the whole issue. Yes?
Well, the other problem is if the king isn't righteous, that's going to make God mad at the people even more.
Yeah, but that's the whole point here. God is going to get mad eventually. So you'd rather be at the beginning of the line rather than get the brunt of the anger. That's the whole point. But I'm saying, okay, so I don't understand what that means, that God gets increasingly angry, like he only finds out about the stuff after, he's been through a few people. And also, it doesn't seem to me, why should the king get off easy? So if anything, it should be the opposite. And you could explain it the opposite way, yes.
For those who think that Wall Street Titans got off easy, it's
yes.
interesting to think of it that.
Right, there you go. Right, you always find some patsy to sort of take the blame. All right, Shmitin. Now, okay, so by the way, I should note that this was one read, and probably not the most shocking read, of this line in the Mishnah that Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for being judged. Right? It's one read. The Gemara had this nice little Agadata. We had a nice little discussion, but it's probably not pshat in the Mishnah. And I want to remind you of this point that a first Mishnah, which introduces the Rosh Hashanah, it's talking about obfuscating Rosh Chodesh. It sort of obfuscates the significance of Rosh Hashanah of Tishrei. Right? It's not any more significant than Elul or than Nisan or than whatever Shvat. And, it's just somewhere buried in the list. And the whole idea of it as a Chag and as a Yom Hadin is also, not really explicit. Probably not even, this is probably not even Pshat. So that's worth thinking about again in a Masechet. I mentioned this on the first day, that's devoted to Rosh Hashanah, the way it starts by downplaying, and almost hiding the significance of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, we'll go back to that once we start talking about it as a Yom Hadin more explicitly. Yes?
I read this phrase, Delifos Charonav, in exactly the opposite way. Why can't it be that they go first because all the anger comes out, right?
No, because of the word mikni. Before increases the charon av.
I read it makme, pause.
No,
they come first, in order to absorb all the rage that comes out.
Yeah, it's a very creative rereading, but it's not shot. Okay. Ulishmitim. All right. Ulishmitim. So now it's Rosh Hashanah also for Shemitah. The Shemitah year begins on Tishrei. Okay. Minola. How do you know? Who knows? Maybe it begins in Nisan. How do you know that the Shemitah, the 7-year cycle is incremented and defined by Tishrei? L'chsi, ubashana hashvi'it, Shabbat Shabbaton, last week's parsha Yela Aretz. The Gomer, Shana Shana Tishrei. So it says a year, and we learn from Tishrei, T'chsiv, Mereshit HaShana v'ad Hacharit Shana, which we just got through proving was Tishrei. So if that Shana means Tishrei, this Shana, this year cycle for the Shemitah is also Tishrei. It says, V'ligmar Shana Shana Nisan. How about it says Shana also by Nisan? T'chsiv, V'shonu lachem l'chadshei HaShana. It's the first of the months, which we know is Nisan. No, says the Gemara, Danim Shana She'eni Machadashim, Shana She'eni Machadashim. The two occurrences, Bashana Sheni Shabbat Shabbaton Yeretz, Bashana HaShavi'it did not have the word Chodesh. And Mereshit HaShana did not have the word Chodesh. So that's simple Shana. Simple Shana without the emphasis of Chodesh is Tishrei. The Ein Danim Shana She'eni Machadashim, you don't look at a pasuk that says Shana HaShavi'it without mentioning Chodesh. Mishana Sheyesh Machadashim, from the verse of Nisan, Vishonu lachem l'chadshei HaShana, which mentions Shana in the context of Chodesh. And by the way, you could just say it's a technical point, different phrasing of the words, so, you have to make your Gzeira Shava in the most similar way. But it also could be that, no, the significance of Nisan is the Rosh Hashanah for Chodashim. The significance of Nisan is that's when you begin the month counting, but that is not to be applied to other cases where it's about the year as a whole. That starts at Tishrei. So Tishrei is, as we said, there are two systems going on: the agricultural one, the pre-Matan Torah one, if you would, that is Tishrei incremented, and then the Rishon Hulachem, the Nisan one. And for these agricultural mitzvot, we are going by the agricultural cycle of the year, which is defined as Tishrei. Okay, so that's Shemitah. Uli Yovlot, and for Yovel, so the Gemara says Yovlos, Yovelos Bechad B'Tishrei. Does the Yovel happen on the first of Tishrei? Yovlos b'Yom Tishrei. Yovel happens on Yom Kippur. Y'chsi b'Yom Kippurim taviu shofar b'chol artzachem. So it's not the first of Tishrei, and we know in the Mishnah we deal with things that are in the middle of the month separately. 1 in Shvat, 15 in Shvat. So how here do we just say Tishrei for Yovel? It's really the 10th of Tishrei. So the Gemara says, "How many Rabbi Yishmael Shebenoy Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka?" Yeah, you're right. But the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, that gives weight even for Yovel to the first of Tishrei. The time we turn the Brisa. The Kiddush 10, 8 Shnat v'Chamishim Shana. You shall sanctify the 50th year. Not Talmud Lomar. Why does it say sanctify the year? Right? It already tells you what you do on Yom Kippur. Lefi shenemar, because since the verse says B'Yom Kippurim taviu shofar b'chol artzachem, that you blow the shofar on Yom Kippur, that's when things start. Maybe the year only gets sanctified and gets its identity as a Yovel year starting in Yom Kippur. You sanctify the whole year, and when the year begins is on Rosh Hashanah. The sanctity starts from its very beginning, which, as we learned before, and we know from Shemitah, which is sort of part of the cycle. This is part of is Tishrei. So the sanctifying of the year means the beginning of the year. So now, what's then the significance of Yom Kippur? So Mikan Amar Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Here's how it would play out. Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim, from Rosh Hashanah till Yom Kippur, lo yuhavadim niftarim lebatehem, v'lo mishtablim ladonehem. You would be sort of in this, middle zone, like limbo, exactly. The slaves wouldn't go home; they wouldn't be freed. How do you know? Because what does the Torah say after you shall blow the shofar?
Kratem dror.
Taviru shofar b'chol artzachem, ukratem dror la'aretz l'chol yoshveh. Right, the pasuk from the Liberty Bell. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. That's what the blowing of the shofar is. No bells, shofar. Okay, so the slaves aren't free until Yom Kippur, but the year is sanctified from Rosh Hashanah. So they are not yet, their status as free men has not yet been realized, but at the same time, you cannot enslave them. Okay, the same way you can't, let's say, work the land starting on Rosh Hashanah, right? It was also true last year because of Shemitah. But you cannot have that control over them. But that actual ultimate redemption and freedom only comes on Yom Kippur. Lo hayu avadim niftarim lebetehem. They would not go home. But lo mishtabdim ladonehem, and they would not be, enslaved to their masters. Ela ochlim v'shosim usmeichim. They would eat and drink and rejoice. Because of anticipating what will happen. They could be wearing crowns on their heads. They could be going around acting like big shots. And when Yom Kippur came, Tiku Basin b'shofar, they would blow the shofar, then Nifteru Avadim lebatehem, then the ultimate redemption would occur. The slaves would go back to their houses, the Sadot Chosrot lebalehem, and the fields would go back to their owners. What's also nice about this is it also sort of creates this, because this is all an image of an Olam Haba and a perfect world, and the Yovel, the sense of redemption doesn't happen in automatically. There's a middle period where things are, it's like things are better, but it's not yet Rav Kook, it's Chalto de Geula. It's not yet the ultimate redemption. Okay, that takes that's another stage already. All right, yes.
If the master can present the bill after Yom Kippur for the food that they
ate. Yeah, I was wondering. I was asking that question. Who's eating it? Who's paying for the food and drink? I was wondering that. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Okay, so therefore it starts at Rosh Hashanah, V'Rabbanan, and the rabbis. Now, by the way, nobody explicitly argues on Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, at least not that we've seen. But the Gemara assumes that was just his single opinion.
Beautiful.
The rabbis would say it would all start on Yom Kippur. So if it all starts. So what do they do with the idea of sanctifying the 50th year? If it all starts on Yom Kippur, that's to tell you something else. Shanim atam mekadesh. You only sanctify years. V'shkidashtem eight shenat v'chamishim shana. You only sanctify years. V'yatam kadesh chadashim. You do not sanctify months. What does that mean? Because there actually is an opinion, which the Gemara is now attributing to these rabbis, that says that in a normal case of Kiddush HaChodesh, that Beis Din does not have an obligation to do Kiddush HaChodesh. You know, that's what happens naturally. But this act of Mikudash, no, that role of sanctifying is limited to years, the Jubilee year. It's not something you do by month. Now, that's very much against our assumption. Our assumption, right? We always hear that Beis Din accepts the witnesses and does this act of sanctification of Mikudash.
Is there a bracha that they would say, the act of sanctification?
I don't think so. Oh, you mean by Yovel, because they were doing the mitzvah, maybe. Okay.
I just say it's beautiful and everything. It's very ideal. In reality, you can imagine it would be very awkward also.
During these 10 days?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You know, maybe it's also to get the masters, acclimate them to what they're going to have to do. It's really hard to do this. So if you have 10 days of building up to it.
So process-oriented.
Oh, there you go. Moving on. Okay. Tanya Idach, we another bright say, Yovel hi, Mal Talmud Lomar, it is the Jubilee year. What is that teaching you? Lefi shenemar, v'kidash shem shnas ha'chamishim, sanctify the 50th year, Yochel k'shem shem mitkadesh v'olech mitzvatot. This is obviously reflective of Yochanan ben Broka. It's the sanctity begins and continues, starts at the beginning of the year and then grows. So it starts on Rosh Hashanah, but it ultimately reaches its apex on Yom Kippur. So the same way that's true at the beginning. Kach mitkadeshet. So I would logically say maybe the same is true at the end. Like maybe it peters out at the end. Like maybe from Rosh Hashanah of year 51 to Yom Kippur, maybe there's like a tapering off. The same way there was a tapering up. I don't know if that's a word. There was an acclimating. There's also like a deacclimating at the end. The Alti Tamad, do not be astounded. We have a principle that you add from the non-sanctified to the sanctified. You start Shabbos early, you end it late. So maybe the Torah would be telling me that the Yovel year should go through the Yom Kippur of the next year. In the same way it moves, if there's a process of moving up, maybe there's a process of moving down. So that's why the verse says no. Yovel hi shnasa chamishim shana. It is the Jubilee year, the 50th year. Shnas chamishim atam mekadesh. Only the 50th year. V'i atam mekadesh shnas chamishim achas. You do not sanctify the 51st year. And just one more line. V'Rabbanan. Now the rabbis who don't think there was an acclimating process, for them maybe it would be obvious you would not go into the next year. So according to the rabbis, why do you need the pasuk to say Yovel hi? Obviously it's only about the 50th year for the following purpose. To tell you, Shnas chamishim atam moneh, you count the year, the 50th year, v'yatom moneh shnas chamishim ve'achat. Now you don't. Now you could read this as you don't count it as 51, and the answer is, of course you don't count it as 51. It's 50. So the real girsa here says is without the vav. You count this as the 50th year, and v'yatom moneh shnas chamishim achas. You don't count the 50th year 1. Why might you count it as 1? 1 for the next cycle. So here's the question. Is it a 49-year cycle or a 50-year cycle? When does 1 begin? Does 1 begin on year 50 or on year 51? So this is saying, Yovel hi shnas chamishim shana. This is only year 50. It is not year 1. Year 1 will be next year. Okay? La'afu kemi Rabbi Yehuda, to reject the position of Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar shnas chamishim oleh l'kan l'kan. Rabbi Yehuda says year 50 counts as the 50th year of the previous and the beginning, year number 1 of the next cycle. It's a 49-year cycle. Kamash Malan, below. And for them, they would read the pasuk to say, it is the 50th, all it is the 50th year, and that's its entire identity. Year 1 will begin next year. Okay.
Thank you.